Muslim politics and the foundation of the Muslim League, the mainstream Indian nationalism, which was growing under the aegis of the Indian National Congress and which, as we have seen previously, failed to maintain its separation from the blooming Hindu nationalism, was first contested by the Muslims. However, in the late 19th century, the Muslims were by no means a homogeneous community with a discernible political opinion. In the whole of India, including the princely states, they constituted 19.7% of the population in 1881, but there were significant regional variations in their distribution. In the United Provinces, the Muslims constituted a minority, being slightly more than 13% of the population, but in Punjab, on the other hand, they were a majority, accounting for slightly more than 51% of the population, 90 in Bengal. The census of 1872 revealed to everybody's surprise that the Muslims represented nearly half of the population, 49.2%. 91 Apart from such dissimilarities in demographic characteristics, there were also other important differences in the position and composition of the Muslim community spread over the subcontinent, such as, most significantly, sectarian differences, Shia-Sunni, linguistic barriers and economic disparities. The colonial authorities, while defining the indigenous society for administrative management, ignored such demographic incongruities and diversity of status. So also the finer distinctions in regional philosophical orientations of South Asian Islam were ignored, and an image of a homogeneous, religio-political community was conjured up. A section the Muslim population, writes Mushirul Hasan, also began to see themselves in the colonial image of being unified, cohesive, and segregated from the Hindus. They started homogenizing such myths to construct a Muslim community identity that was later enlarged into Muslim nationhood. 92 The evolution of a politicized Muslim communitarian identity in the late 19th century, it is true, was not entirely in response to initiatives from above. But we should nevertheless keep in mind the new institutionalized knowledge of social taxonomy that colonial rule offered, and the new public space it created in setting a context for such cultural constructions, which could later be so easily connected to wider political projects. The major premise of colonial cognition of Indian society was the theme of differentiation, 93, which was traced, mapped and enumerated through various official ethnographic studies, and finally, since 1872, through decennial census reports. The Indian colonial census, unlike its British predecessor, made religion its fundamental ethnographic category for ordering and classifying demographic and developmental data. Each census report sought to give concrete and recognizable shape to the religious communities, by discussing the numerical size of such groups, their percentage to the whole population, relative or absolute decline, and geographic distribution, indicating their majority or minority status in each region and in the country as a whole. The breakup of literacy and occupational statistics according to religion provided an apparently objective picture of the relative or comparative material and social conditions of each religious community. The result of this census taxonomy was the new concept of religion as a community. Religion did no longer mean just a set of ideas, but came to be identified with an aggregate of individuals united by formal official definition, sharing supposedly the same characteristics, and conscious of their comparative demographic as well as socio-economic position vis-à-vis other communities. 94 It was this universalized knowledge which made a difference between pre-colonial localized relations between religious groups and colonial competition and conflict among subcontinental religious communities. 4. This colonial knowledge of a redefined religion was incorporated into every structure that the state created, every opportunity that it offered to the colonial subjects, from educational facilities, public employment, representation in local self-governing bodies to entry into the expanded legislative councils. However much the government trumpeted the secular character of this public space, and confined religion to the private, The boundaries remained highly permeable, and it was within this context that the relationship between religious groups were reconstituted in the late 19th century. As Hindu mobilization made progress, it also simultaneously sculpted and vilified its other, the Muslims. The latter too began to discover their community identity, informed by their common religion and an invented shared past. How an aggressive Arya Samaj movement contributed to the counter-mobilization of the Muslims in urban Punjab, we have already seen earlier. In the countryside too, Islam penetrated rural politics in the 19th century through such intermediaries as the Sajjad Nishins, Pirs and the Ulma. However, so far as the India Muslim politics was concerned, its leadership and main impetus in the late 19th century came primarily from the United Provinces, previously Northwestern Provinces and Awadh, and to a lesser extent from Bengal. So it is on these two areas that we will focus more intensively in this section. So far as the Bengal Muslims were concerned, as it has been shown in some recent studies, 96 they were a highly fragmented group, vaguely united by a common allegiance to the essentials of the Islamic faith. There were considerable economic differences within the community, with a minority of large landed magnates at the top and a majority of poor peasants at the bottom. This also coincided with the significant cultural differentiation between the Ashraf and the Ajlaf, or Atrap, sections within the community. The former were divided into two segments, the urban Urdu-speaking elites and the rural Urdu Bengali-speaking Mofasil landlords. At the other end was the Bengali-speaking peasantry known as the Ajlaf. The two segments represented two distinct cultures. The elites represented a foreign culture, they spoke in Urdu and Hindustani, boasted of foreign racial origin and tried to preserve Delhi or Lucknow court culture. They were averse to manual labor in the same way as the Hindu Bhadralok were, and looked at the indigenous Muslims with unabashed contempt. The lesser Ashraf or the rural Muslim gentry were, however, closer to the Bengali-speaking peasantry in their language, manners and customs, yet there was very little social interaction between the two groups. The Atrap or the Ajlaf, on the other hand, were the common mass of peasantry, mainly residing in the swampy low-lying areas of caste Bengal. How Islam could spread among the masses of Bengal is a question that has now two plausible historical answers, as opposed to the previous, now rejected, social emancipation theory of conversion of the low-caste Hindus. Richard Ayton argues that as the frontiers of cultivation expanded between the 16th and the 18th centuries in eastern Bengal, https:// From the core of Brahmanic civilization, Islam also spread as the religion of the plough, bringing local people gradually into its fold. This Islamization did not take place at one stroke, but as a gradual process, slowly absorbing the colonizers of the land, who were not yet touched or only just slightly touched by Hinduism. The creation of a Muslim peasantry in Bengal was therefore not the result of any large-scale conversion, but of gradual incorporation of people residing at the periphery of Brahmanical civilization. 97 Asim Roy, 1983, on the other hand, has argued that under the leadership of a group of cultural mediators, consisting of a section of Bengali-speaking Muslim literati and religious preachers, Pirs, Islam in Bengal in the 16th-17th centuries acquired a syncretistic phase by borrowing generously from local religious and cultural traditions. This reconstructed Islamic great tradition was more acceptable to the masses, as it resolved the problem of dualism between the Persianized and Arabic Islamic high culture of the Ashraf and the Bengali culture of the Ajlaf peasants. Coming to the more modern period, the Muslim community in Bengal, unlike the Hindus, clearly lacked a sizable educated professional intermediary group, which could close the hiatus between the two sections of their population in the newly instituted colonial public space. This was because of their backward position in educational status both in absolute numbers as well as in relative terms vis-à-vis the Hindus. In 1874–75, the Muslims constituted only 29% of the school-going population in Bengal as against 70.1% Hindus. They had even lesser share at the higher levels of education. In 187–5 the Muslims represented 5.4% of the college students, as against 93.9% Hindus, and only 1.50% of the Muslim literates were English-knowing, compared with 4.40% among the Hindus. And this poor representation in education was reflected also in the employment situation. In 1871 the Muslims constituted only 5.9% of the government officials in Bengal proper, while the Hindus accounted for 41%. As many reasons have been offered to explain this Muslim backwardness, such as the vanity of the Ashraf as a humiliated ruling class, their economic decline following the permanent settlement, supersession of Persian by English as the official language in 183–7, their religious aversion to an un-Islamic education, etc. But we cannot explain this phenomenon by only looking at the Ashraf segment that constituted only a tiny minority within the community. The majority were the poor cultivators who shared the general apathy towards education, and whenever they sent their children to school, they preferred indigenous, less expensive traditional institutions, like the maktabs and madrasas. This explains to a large extent the underrepresentation of the Muslims in Western education. This also indicates that the problems of the Muslim peasantry were different. They constituted a disadvantaged majority in the eastern parts of Bengal where land holding was largely monopolized by the Hindus. The backwardness of the two segments of Muslim population had thus been of too different nature. It was only the colonial stereotyping, propounded through books like W. W. Hunter's The Indian Mussalmans, 1871, which mistakenly presented the image of a homogeneous community, suffering from backwardness in education and employment. The interests of the Ashraf section were thus presented as the interests of the entire community, and it was on this stereotype that Muslim politics was eventually to construct itself. The situation in North India was slightly different. As it was the center of Mughal rule, the Muslim elites here constituted a privileged minority, which was gradually losing ground to the Hindus during the British period. There were some large landed magnates, like the Awadh Tluktars, who controlled 1/5 of the land in the United Provinces. Not many of them were however in business, which was largely dominated by the Hindus. But the Muslims were well represented in high administrative jobs since the Mughal days, and this predominance continued into the early British period. As late as 1882, the Muslims held as many as 35% of government jobs in UP, with a fair share of high and influential positions as well. But as under British rule English came to replace Persian as the official language, the Muslims began to lose their position of power and influence to the Hindus, who could adapt to the new official environment more quickly. Their position in the subordinate executive and judicial services declined from 63.9% in 1857 to 45.1% in 1886 to 87 and to 34.7% in 1913, whereas the Hindus improved their representation in these services from 24.1% to 50.3% to 60% during the same time span. 99 In other words, in course of a little more than half a century, the relative position of the two communities in the public services had just been reversed. These North Indian Muslim elites, representing the heritage of Mughal aristocratic culture, were also separated from the Muslim masses, and unlike their Bengali counterparts, they were at odds with the ulama, who exercised considerable influence over the peasantry. The traditional theocratic order was in conflict with the British rule, which had threatened the traditional system and their own predominance. The elites on the other hand had accepted HTTPS subordination and were trying to adjust to the new social realities of British rule. The Muslims of North India were thus divided along many lines. Francis Robinson has depicted the UP Muslims as more a multiplicity of interests than a commonality. P. David Lelyveld has argued that this was a legacy of the Mughal social structure of asymmetrical hierarchical kinship-like alliances, linked separately to the imperial dynasty, but rarely experiencing any horizontal solidarity across ethnic, racial or family identities. It was this segmented society which in the late 19th century gradually evolved a common identity or a sense of belonging to a coim, with a manifest destiny. In all the regions the Muslims suffered from a sense of relative deprivation in comparison with the Hindus, although this feeling was shared differently by the richer and poorer sections of the community. Gradually, however, when the political mobilization of the Muslims began, the interests of the peasants came to be subordinated to the interests of the elites, which were projected as the interests of the entire community. Among the Bengal Muslims, a distinct Muslim identity had been developing at a mass level from the early 19th century through various Islamic reform movements. These movements rejected the earlier syncretism and sought to Islamize and Arabicize the culture, language and daily habits of the Muslim peasants by purging whatever they thought to be of un-Islamic origin. This gave the lower orders or ajlaf a sense of social mobility. They could think of their mythical foreign or Arabic origin and could feel a sense of identity with the upper-class Sharif Muslims. This was developed through various agencies, such as the itinerant mullahs, the bahas, or religious meetings, and the anjumans or local associations. No initiative of the elites was directly involved in the growth of this Muslim consciousness among the masses, but this certainly helped them in political mobilization and in strengthening their argument about separate Muslim interests. The elite leaders soon linked this new sentiment to their relative backward condition and the need to organize themselves as a political pressure group to demand their just share of the institutional opportunities created by colonial rule. The first Muslim organization in Bengal was the Mohammedan Association or the Anjuman-i-Islami, established in 1855 with twofold objective of promoting the interests of the community and preaching loyalty to the British. In a petition to the Lieutenant Governor it demanded, no exclusive privilege, but a fair field, to compete on equal terms with the Hindus. To ensure this it advocated special measure to spread education, expressed loyalty to the Raj and condemned the revolt of 1008. The essentials of Muslim politics had thus taken shape in Bengal even before the more well-known Sayyid Ahmed Khan's movement was started in UP. It soon took the form of a modernization campaign started around the middle of the 19th century. It gathered more momentum in the 1860s and developed two distinct strands. Abdul Latif Khan and his Mohammedan Literary Society, 1863, stood for Western education within the traditional Islamic education system, retaining full emphasis on Arabic and Persian learning. Sayyid Amir Ali and his Central National Mohammedan Association, 1877-78, on the other hand, advocated a total reorganization of Muslim education on Western and secular model or total Anglicization of Muslim education. And although initially the Bengali Muslim elites had demanded a fair field, and not exclusive privileges, they gradually changed their position and in this they were encouraged by the colonial bureaucracy. Hunter's book in 1871 had put forth the thesis that it was the exclusion of the Muslims from the government-sponsored education system and civil employment that was mainly responsible for greater popular appeal of the anti-British Wahhabi and Fariji movements. A faulty thesis though it was, he advocated on its basis a policy of special government favor for the Muslims in matters of education and employment. The Government of India resolution of 7 August set the trend by providing increased state assistance for Muslim educational institutions. The policy was further reaffirmed in Lord Northbrook's resolution of 13 June 187-5 and finally endorsed by the Education Commission, which provided for special provision for Muslim education as a matter of justice. The Central National Mohammedan Association, CNMA, in a number of memoranda in 1882 and 1888 also demanded special favor and not just fair justice in matters of employment in government services. The government also endorsed this policy for the political exigency of rallying the Muslims as a counterpoise against the rising tide of Indian nationalism, which was predominantly Hindu in participation. This policy of providing protection to the Muslims to ensure their proper representation in government services was first initiated in a resolution of July 1885. It received a concrete shape in the Circular of 1897, which provided that 2/3 of vacancies in subordinate executive services were to be filled up by nomination to secure a balance between the communities. The policy was finally institutionalized in the partition of Bangor, which created a new province in the Muslim-dominated eastern Bengal to ensure for them a greater share of power. In no time the anti-partition agitation appeared in Muslim consciousness as an anti-Muslim campaign. Only the professional and commercial people among them who were centered at Calcutta and whose interests were directly affected by the partition remained the supporters of the movement. The rest of the Bengali Muslim society, both the elites and their peasant followers, had begun to pull in a different direction. If the Anjumans prepared the Bengali Muslims for activities in the colonial public space, in North India in the late 19th century a variety of locally instituted bodies, such as Anjumans, neighborhood akhras, festival committees and so on got involved in popular cultural activities that gradually constructed the cultural identities based on a symbolic religious vocabulary that demarcated the boundaries between communities. Contestation over the sacred public space or ceremonies led to communal riots between Hindus and Muslims, and there was no dearth of them in Bareilly in the 1870s, in Agra in the 1880s, and finally the cow protection riots in the 1890s. Such expressions of relational community, bound by shared values and symbolic idioms in a localized public arena, argues Sundriya Freitag, could later be enlarged into broader and more abstract, ideological community, that became operational in institutional politics at a subcontinental level. 106 And if such popular cultural activities provided for a behavioral text of identity formation, there were also some other implements of colonial modernity, which provided for the construction of a literary discursive field for the formation of a communitarian ideology or identity as culture. In North India in the late 19th century, as Aisha Jalal points out, a vibrant regional press and a flourishing Urdu popular poetry were contributing towards the crafting of what she calls a religiously informed cultural identity for the Muslims of United Provinces and Punjab. And since poetry was also read in public recitals or mushairas, it had the potential to bridge the hiatus between elites and the masses. Such a reconstituted cultural identity or an ideological community, based on imaginatively shared values and interests, could later be deployed in the institutional politics of identity. But so far as the North Indian Muslims were concerned, central to this transformatory process was Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan and his Aligarh movement. Sir Sayyid started a modernization movement among the Muslims and founded for this purpose the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College in Aligarh in 1875. As David Littlefield has shown, His political philosophy revolved round the idea that Indian society was https://telegram.me/ seriousness stand. This particular trend in Muslim politics was patronized by the British bureaucracy. Particularly significant was the role of Theodore Beck, the European principal of the Aligarh College, who formed in 1888 the Indian Patriotic Association to oppose Congress and to plead for government patronage for the Muslims. In 1893 the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental Defence Association was formed, once again with Beck's encouragement, to check the growing popularity of the Congress and to organize Muslim public opinion against it. So Aligarh movement under Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan and his Aligarh College developed in opposition to Congress-led nationalism and in loyalty to the British Raj, which was conceived as a legitimate successor to the Mughal Empire. However, Sir Sayyid's leadership was never universally accepted in the North Indian Muslim community. The ulama certainly did not like his thrust towards westernization, which seemed to threaten their preeminence in Muslim society. As opposed to his modernism and rationality, they invoked Islamic universalism and exclusivism. There were men like Jamaluddin al-Afghani who were rabid anti-colonialist and did not like Sir Sayyid's loyalism. He was ridiculed for his imitative Western ways and unabashed championing of specific class interests. By the late 1880s many Muslims in North India were tilting towards the Congress, while in 1887 Badruddin Kyabji of Bombay had become its first Muslim president. By the late 1890s many of the Urdu newspapers in Punjab were asserting that the Aligarh school did not represent the Indian Mohammedans. 110 After Sir Sayyid's death in 1898, even the younger generation at Aligarh became restless, as they began to feel that they were losing out because they were not properly organized and hence could not voice their demands effectively. As a result, they gradually began to deviate from the existing tradition of Aligarh politics. For example, the earlier politicians of Sir Sayyid's generation had kept the ulama at arm's length in favor of the Western-educated intelligentsia. The politics of this period was confined to what Lelyveld has called Kachari-linked family groups, who deployed their Muslim identity only in self-defense. But by contrast, the younger leaders like Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali were profoundly influenced by the ulama, like Maulana Abdul Bari, and through their influence they rediscovered the inspiration of Islam as a mobilizing force. This resulted in what may be called a gradual Islamization of Muslim politics. The younger leaders also started deviating from the loyalist stand of Sayyid Ahmed, and partly responsible for this was Lieutenant Governor MacDonald's unsympathetic policies towards United Provinces Muslims. He preferred the Hindus to the Muslims, it was alleged, and this preference was reflected in the Nagri Resolution of 18 April 1900, which recognized the Nagri script, along with Persian, for official use in the courts. This sparked off, as mentioned earlier, what is often referred to as the Hindi-Urdu controversy, as language now became a trope for community honor and a focus for mobilization. And soon to this campaign was added a demand for an all-India Muslim university as a cultural center of pan-Indian Islam. But the leaders of the older generation, like Mohsin-ul-Mulk, soon backed out of this agitation, as MacDonald threatened to cut off grants for the Aligarh College. So the younger generation was left alone to protest against discriminatory government policies, and in no rhyme they realized the inadequacies of Sayyid Ahmed's loyalist politics. Some of them even threatened to join the Congress. So the older leaders and the colonial bureaucracy now felt the urgent need for a political organization for the Muslims in order to mobilize the community against the Congress and also to offer an independent political platform, as many of the Bengal, Punjab and Bombay Muslim leaders were not prepared to accept Aligarh's leadership. The Bengali Muslims had been coming closer to their North Indian co-religionists since 1899, when the annual Mohammedan Educational Conference was held at Calcutta. But the events of 1906 brought them even closer, though not entirely on cordial terms. In eastern Bengal, the resignation of Lieutenant Governor Bumperfield Fuller, known for his pro-partition and pro-Muslim sympathies, and the possibility of partition itself being rescinded, made the Bengal Muslim leadership panicky. And then the Secretary of State Morley's budget speech of 1906 indicated that representative government was going to be introduced in India. This alarmed Muslim leaders across the board, as they thought that in the new self-governing bodies they would be swayed by the Hindu majority who were now well organized under the Congress. This provided the context for the similar deputation of October 1906 to the Governor-General Lord Minto. For a long time the prevalent theory was that it was a command performance, entirely stage-managed by the British, through the European principal of the Aligarh College, W.A.J. Archbold. But recent analyses show that the initiative had come from the Aligarh veterans, like Mohsin-ul-Mulk, the secretary of the Aligarh College, who wanted to assuage the feelings of younger Muslims, and it was hoped that the Bengal Muslims would also join any such deputation. But in the end the grievances of the Bengal Muslims were bypassed for being too sensitive or divisive, and no Bengali joined the deputation to Simla. The petition, which the Aligarh leaders drafted, represented only their interests. It depicted the Muslims as a separate community with political interests different from those of the Hindus, and therefore having legitimate claim to minority rights to proportional representation in the representative bodies and public employment. The deputation was given a patient hearing by the Viceroy, and he also assured the East Bengalis that their rights would not be jeopardized. 112 The success of the deputation was a tremendous morale booster to Muslim politics, yet mere verbal assurances were hardly expected to satisfy the younger Muslims. They had long been feeling the need for a separate political organization for themselves. A religious orientation of the movement was also on their agenda, as there has now been, as Lelyveld, 1978, describes it, a clear shift of emphasis from Qaum, community based on common descent, to Ummah, community based on allegiance to a common faith. The 35 delegates at Simla therefore decided to organize the community for independent political action to secure for themselves a recognition from the government as a nation within a nation, to use the words of Aga Khan, the leader of the delegation. 111 The next annual Mohammedan Educational Conference was scheduled to be held in December 1906 in Decca, the capital of the new province of Eastern Bengal and Assam. So it was decided that this opportunity would be taken to launch a new Muslim party. The situation in Decca was already volatile. The nationalist agitation against the partition of Bengal had gained an unexpected momentum, and there was widespread fear among the Bengali Muslims that the government might succumb to the nationalist pressure and annul the partition to the disadvantage of the Muslims. There was already a proposal from Nawab Salimullah of Decca, the leader of the East Bengali Muslims, about the formation of a political party for the Muslims, and this could be an excellent starting point for further discussion. So it was in this Decca Educational Conference on 30th December 1906 that a new party was launched, and it was called the All India Muslim League. Its professed goals were to safeguard the political rights and interests of the Muslims, to preach loyalty to the British, and to further the cause of intercommunal amity. The Muslim supporters of the Congress immediately tried to counteract this move, but in vain. The majority of the educated Muslims had already decided to tread along a different path. Until about 1910, for all practical purposes, the AJJ India Muslim League maintained its existence only as an adjunct of the https://telegram.com Muslim identity from minority status to nationhood took a long and tortuous trajectory, and in the meanwhile the relationship between the League and the Indian National Congress remained on shaky grounds. Between 1920 and 1924 they launched a joint agitation over the issue of Khilafat, but since then their ways progressively drifted apart. We will trace that story further in the subsequent